All right, welcome everyone to today's Explainer. Let's just jump right in, shall we? Go ahead, get your notebooks ready, because today we're embarking on a masterclass in comparative politics. Basically, consider this your Comparative Politics 101. If you've ever looked at the world and wondered, why do some nations completely thrive while others struggle? Or why can two neighboring countries have vastly different governments? Well, you are exactly in the right place. Today, we're going to unpack the scientific tools and the big overarching theories that political scientists actually use to systematically analyze governments. So consider this your syllabus for the day. We'll start with a quick welcome to comparative politics, move into Lipfart's comparative method, and then tackle solving the small n problem. After that, we'll break down the three new institutionalisms, compare those institutional frameworks, and finally, we'll wrap up with why institutions matter today. Okay, part one. Welcome to comparative politics. Okay, let's dive into this. Comparative politics is, at its core, the study of domestic politics across different countries. But doing this scientifically, that requires a very specific approach. Because here's the absolute core puzzle we face as comparativists. Think about a chemist or a physicist. If they want to test a hypothesis, what do? They go into a laboratory, they isolate their variables, and they run an experiment literally thousands of times. But we're political scientists. We can't just put an entire nation, like, say, France or Japan, into a beaker. I mean, imagine trying to stuff the entire French parliament into a petri dish. It's just not going to fit, and honestly, they'd probably complain about the food. We can't randomly assign a parliamentary system to one country and a presidential system to another just to see what happens, right? We have to study the real world. And the real world only gives us a limited number of sovereign states. So how on earth do we conduct rigorous scientific research when we only have a few empirical cases to actually look at? Which brings us to section 2, Lipfart's comparative method. To answer that whole how do we study this question, we have to turn to a foundational pillar of our discipline, and that is the methodology proposed by political scientist Arend Lischpart back in his really seminal 1971 paper. This brilliantly illustrates exactly where our field sits in the grand realm of science. Notice how Lischpart maps the comparative method directly alongside traditional experimental and statistical methods. The experimental method uses control groups, which, as we just established, we generally can't do. The statistical method relies on massive amounts of data to assess rival explanations, but we often just don't have enough cases, meaning countries, to make the math work perfectly. So Lischpart defines the comparative method as the systematic analysis of a small number of cases. He basically argues that the intensive, deep dive analysis of a few cases can actually be way more promising than a superficial statistical analysis of many. Moving on to section 3, solving the small n problem. Now, Lischpart wasn't blind to the challenges of his method. He directly addressed what we call the small n problem. In statistics, n just stands for the number of cases. So the principal difficulty facing us comparativists is trying to establish big scientific generalizations when you have tons of variables but very few actual cases. To empower you to conduct valid research, Lischpart outlined 4 specific strategies to solve the small n difficulty. Number 1, increase your number of cases. You can do this by looking at a broader global range, or maybe extending your timeline chronologically. Number 2, reduce the property space of the analysis. This basically means combine your variables or use more parsimonious theories just to keep things manageable. Number 3, and this is a really big one, focus on comparable cases. By comparing countries that are already very similar, say 2 Scandinavian nations, you naturally control for a lot of background variables like culture or geography. And finally, number 4, relentlessly focus on only your key variables. Don't get lost in the noise. By applying these 4 rules, we literally transform basic observation into rigorous comparative science. All right, shifting gears to section 4, the 3 new institutionalisms. So now that we have a really solid grasp on how we compare, let's transition to what we compare. And in modern political science, that means we need to talk about the new institutionalism. To understand this, we look to the work of scholars like Peter A. Hall and Rosemary C. R. Taylor. Back in the mid-20th century, the field was totally dominated by behavioralism. That's the idea that politics is just the sum of individual human actions and psychology. But later on, political science took this massive institutional turn. Researchers woke up to the fact that human behavior doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It happens within structures. And institutions aren't just, big marble government buildings. They are the formal rules, the informal norms, and the deep historical structures that both constrain and facilitate what we do. But, as Hall and Taylor pointed out, there isn't just one single way to look at institutions. There are actually 3 distinct flavors. Let's look at the very first flavor, historical institutionalism.
Now, this approach takes a long view. Historical institutionalists believe that history matters profoundly. They focus heavily on concepts like path dependence. Think of it kind of like walking through a really dense forest. Once a path is cleared by someone, it's just so much easier for everyone else to keep walking down that exact same path than to hack out a brand new one, even if the new one would technically be a shorter route. They also study what they call critical junctures. These are those rare, pivotal moments of crisis or change where small, almost random events lock a society into a specific institutional trajectory that becomes incredibly hard to reverse later on.
Okay, now let's contrast that with our second flavor, rational choice institutionalism. This approach borrows heavily from microeconomics. It basically treats humans as perfectly rational, strategic, utility-maximizing actors. If you want a helpful analogy here, think of institutions as the rules of a game. The players in this game are completely calculating, they want to win, and they're going to adapt their strategies based entirely on those rules. According to this framework, institutions only exist because they're functional. They solve collective action problems, they reduce transaction costs, and they enforce agreements among politicians who are essentially just looking out for their own self-interest. And finally, we have sociological institutionalism. This theory moves us completely away from that pure, cold, calculated self-interest we just talked about. Sociological institutionalists argue, hey, humans aren't just calculating machines, we're social creatures. Here, institutions are defined much more broadly. They include cognitive frames, moral templates, and cultural norms. Behavior isn't driven by a logic of consequence, which basically means asking what's in it for me, but rather it's driven by a deeply internalized logic of appropriateness. People are constantly asking themselves, what is a person like me supposed to do in a situation like this? We follow cultural scripts.
Next up, Section 5, Comparing the Institutional Frameworks. Now, what's really fascinating here is that Hall and Taylor noted these three schools developed somewhat independently of each other. But when you synthesize them directly, it reveals the major fault lines in modern political science. Let's actually walk through this matrix row by row. Look at the core view. Historical institutionalists see institutions as power structures that create winners and losers over time. Rational choice sees them as efficient equilibria designed to solve problems, and sociological sees them as cultural norms. Now look at actor behavior. Rational choice assumes fixed utility-maximizing preferences. Sociological assumes cultural compliance. Historical institutionalism is a bit more eclectic, kind of borrowing from both. And finally, the causal mechanism. How does change actually happen? For historical, it's all about path dependence and the timing of events. For rational choice, behavior changes only when the incentive structures change. And for sociological, behavior shifts through socialization and the sharing of cognitive templates. If you can grasp this table, you grasp the foundational debates of modern comparative politics. And finally, Section 6, Why Institutions Matter Today. So the crucial point is this. Why are we spending all this time learning this theory? It isn't just to pass a midterm exam. It's because these frameworks are the exact lenses through which we can decode the absolute chaos of the modern political world. I want to leave you with this really powerful quote from the legendary sociologist and political scientist Charles Tilly. He said, "Explanatory political science can hardly get anywhere without relying on careful historical analysis. You literally cannot understand the policies, the conflicts, or the economic conditions of today without understanding the institutional rules of the game and the historical paths that forged those rules in the first place. Mastering the comparative method and these theories of institutionalism, that gives you the power to see the deep structures beneath our daily headlines." So, I want to conclude our explainer today with a bit of a homework assignment for you. I want you to think about a modern political crisis. Maybe it's an economic reform that totally failed, a democratic backslide in a specific country you've been following, or a tense international treaty negotiation. If you had to explain that crisis, which framework would you pull out of your toolbox? Would you look at the historical path dependence, the rational cost-benefit calculations of the leaders, or maybe the cultural norms of that society? Think about it. There is no single right answer, but asking those exact right questions is the true essence of comparative politics. Thank you so much for joining me for this masterclass. Keep questioning, keep comparing, and I will see you in the next explainer.